Okay, part two. Moving on to number 18 on test number one. My number 18 says a section from the Southern Colonies handout contends that Colonial Virginia afforded an economically and politically equal playing field for all English colonists. I wouldn't go that far, right? Remember, this one's called Capitalism for Better and for Worse, and it talks about burgeoning opportunities for the less fortunate, such as through indentured servitude and squatting upon available land. Through historians like Paul Johnson, but it doesn't go so far as to say that it leveled the playing field, right? The head right system and other advantages were clearly present for those gentrymen and those who came with more money, all right? Moving on to numbers 19 and 20. Remember, Court History is by David Price. He's going to defend John Smith, which is completely politically incorrect and kind of anomalous for today's historiography. But he is going to defend Captain John Smith and contend, right, that he is a mini example, a microcosm of a future American leader, that he earned his stripes, his pragmatic leadership, his decisiveness, right, his sagacity, his worldly wisdom helped were just what the colony needed in its precarious time against Powhatan and his mighty Confederacy. And then Helen Roundtree, of course, is more of a standard conflict history, right? Just from the title of her book, right? She says it from the perspective of Pocahontas, Powhatan, Opechancanough, and their encounter with the strangers, these white bearded strangers who came to Virginia. And so from their perspective, right, the Englishmen were deceitful. They were the ugly imperialist who knew that he was not going to be wanted, but he came anyway, who came and deliberately embraced a posture of distrust, right, of mutual distrust, and just wanting to get whatever he wanted selfishly, regardless of what he anticipated that the Powhatan and native tribes wanted or didn't want from him. All right, so there you have numbers 18 through 20. Agency. Remember, we talked about when number 21, agency amongst on the test amongst demographics that have had historically been characterized as victims, right? As passive victims. So African Americans, Native Americans, women, etc. Those would all be examples with agency, with historians since the 1970s in particular really stressing that they made key decisions that mattered. They made key decisions that helped turn history in the directions in which it has gone. And so you should be able to find plenty of examples in the Southern Colonies handout for such. The Powhatan being able to wipe out the Jamestown settlement, arguably for the first couple winters, and choosing not to, looking for their weapons and trying to ally with them instead of destroy them against their Monacan enemies. The Huron and Natchez and other tribes of the Mississippi River Delta with the French, throwing their weight around with the French for their own terms, right, in their best interest. African Americans in South Carolina, of all places, making demands upon an acute need for their labor in that book called Black Majority. All right, so all those would be examples found in the handout of such. Let's see here. 22, right out of the textbook. Alan Brinkley contends in the textbook that the Spanish command over Indian labor did not fully meet the demands for labor, so they opted for African slaves subsequently. So again, kind of a similar one to take to the Southern Colonies handout, that slavery was predominantly an economic decision. Very arguable. Does the textbook take that stand? Okay, so take a quick look at that there in the first couple chapters. 23, which of the following was mentioned as a factual support of the thesis that slavery was not a racist but a practical, convenient institution? Diminishing numbers, a waning sense of reliability of white indentured servants, the alleged biological success of African Americans withstanding malaria and other pathogens in the New World, diplomacy and deals, especially with the Spanish and the Native Americans and the English as well, that helped take away a large supply of available Native American labor pool. Okay, so look for all of those as evidence that was used to buttress the thesis that it was an economic decision. Again, a very argumentative point, but you're looking for the data that was used to support that thesis. All right, Bacon's Rebellion, we've talked about this with number 24. Just be familiar with the basics, right? It's supposedly being a very combustible combination of circumstances, right? Inequity. You have that quote from Governor Lord Berkeley where he says, "How miserable is the man who leads the colony where 6 out of 7 people have virtually nothing and have no land, are hungry, and are armed and angry." And so that doesn't meet for a very good situation, giving them false hope with the indentured servitude system, right? Promising them land dues, freedom dues at the end of their tenure. And Virginia, as opposed to Maryland, developed a bad reputation for not making good on those freedom dues. Okay. Some people contending that there's evidence of the Virginia House of Burgesses contending that white indentured servants were too combustible. They had too much hope, too much expectation as a demographic to be employed, and that hence that maybe they ought to go for a more broken, docile demographic like African Americans. Okay, so all those tied to number 24. Number 25, evidence against Fogel and Ingerman's thesis. Just remember that for number 25. Remember their provocative thesis was that because slaves were expensive, they were treated relatively well, materially at least, because they were an expensive investment. And look for evidence in that section against that, right? Look for legal latitude to be able to whip and even beat and even kill your slaves with in some cases very light, considerably light punishment. Look for draconian rules against running away, raising your hand against your master, or any type of defiance on behalf of the slaves. Look at primary source evidence from Madam's diaries and other newspaper accounts of runaways, etc., right? And evidence of discontent and misery and rebellion amongst the slaves for evidence against Fogel and Ingerman's thesis. All right. 26, French Louisiana. Their defiance of old world mercantilist restrictions. Was it deliberate on behalf of the Anson regime, French leadership? Were they trying to make French Louisiana into a land of opportunity, or did it happen organically? All right. And we've already gone through this, that it according to this handout, it makes the contention that it happened organically, that it was not a deliberate attempt on behalf of the French leaders. Number 27, about the French having insufficient numbers, insufficient resources, so Native Americans were able to dictate terms to them. 28, Albion Seed, a very simple thesis, just that the demographic that tended to colonize each section of the Atlantic seaboard made it into its own image. And in the South particularly, it was the gentry class. And the gentry class were old school, right? They were deferential. They were into deference, knowing your place, having a hierarchy, having a class that was above using its hands for labor. And it lent itself to the later South, right, and to Southern culture and the Southern, life ways or folk ways, as explained in Albion Seed, this interesting book by David Hackett Fisher. All right. Then 29, moving on to the northern colonies. This is very subjective, okay, and I hope that I have it qualified that way in your handout that you just did, but oftentimes Roger Williams and William Penn are depicted in court history fashion. They're depicted as emblematic of America going in a unique idealistic direction, right? A direction in which we're particularly proud of as a country, that we're not a run-of-the-mill country that was just built upon greed and desire for resources, but that we had fundamental ideas that our founding fathers, that our leaders believed in and wanted to sway the country into a particular idealistic direction that made it a better place as opposed to Europe and the places that they had come from prior. So like with Roger Williams, right? This guy stood for a separation of church and state in Puritan New England. He stood for the freedom of liberty of conscience, for those not to be directly penalized for their religious beliefs or lack thereof in Puritan New England, but wanted everything to be volitional, according to their own choice and their own freedom. And like I said, I mean, they're picking and choosing data. You could find dirt on virtually anyone, but this oftentimes seems to run the course when you look at a lot of the old history books. So with Roger Williams, oftentimes, as put in the handout, he's depicted in a court history fashion, that he thought of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the General Council in Boston, as being very tyrannical, and he wanted nothing of that. And so when he was banished to Connecticut, he wanted anything but that, and so he established the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut and established freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, almost immediately. And so a very different stark contrast you see in Roger Williams. William Penn, you have 2 sections to read on him. So court history of William Penn, you should have read in the first section on him, right? And you see a very stark contrast that was intended to be made in the first section, whereby he was kind of a superficial, vain man of old school wealth, owing to his father. But then he has this this epiphany, right? This God-oriented turnaround in his life, and he becomes very meek. Remember, very meek is you're very generous and gentle with the strength that God gives you. And so he becomes this meek leader, right, who could have had these near absolute powers as the proprietor or owner of Pennsylvania and New Jersey and parts of Delaware. But instead, right, he gives that power up. And not to mention, as the owner, the proprietor of the land, he's very generous with land allocations and access to credit, etc. in Pennsylvania, so that he goes out of his way to make a colony that has plenty of opportunities for the common immigrant to come in to gain access to land, credit, hence the American dream, and also to participate in government, right? He says, I'll let you have laws of your own choosing in his Charter of Liberties, and not to mention religious toleration, right? In his noble experiment there in Pennsylvania. So he and Roger Williams are oftentimes depicted in court history fashion as heroes who were ahead of their time period, who were ahead of their generation, and wanting to make this a land of opportunity, a land of freedom for as many people as possible, at least for a larger demographic than it had been extended to in their time period. And then the Dutch New Netherlands, right? The handout doesn't go that far with them, right? The Netherlands, and it may have been a little unfair to the Dutch, because when you look at the Netherlands, they had been colonized by Spain. So you could say the same thing as with Roger Williams, that they saw they had experienced religious tyranny under someone else, and that they saw that as an anti-model that they did not want to follow. The thing is when you look at the primary sources of the Dutch West India Company, it was called the VOC was the acronym from the Dutch language. When the Dutch VOC and the Hague and so forth would write about extending opportunities to like the Jewish community in New York City and to the Quakers and other groups, there was another gentleman known as the not Antonio the Negro. There was another one, a North African gentleman but he was known as a black man in the primary sources. Shame on me, it's in the handout. But at any rate, Anthony Van Sally, the Turk. You see evidence of them writing disparagingly of these demographics, of using some of the same stereotypes and negative images of these groups of people that their contemporaries used, but then highlighting the fact that these people were helping economically the colony of Dutch New Netherlands or New York out, so hence they were to be tolerated as such. And so hence, right, it does seem as if there is an ulterior practical economic motive behind their toleration policy. All right, that's the direction I went with the test. I hope that I qualified it enough, because when you look more into this, it's argumentative. All right, but just to get your mind going. Let's see here. William Penn, we've done 30 and 31. Right, one of them is court history, the other one is revisionist. The New England colonies, court and then revisionist on 32 and 33. The court one, right, is the idea that the New England colonies were progressive. They were ahead of their time period. And you should read the section on that. It's pretty self-explanatory, that they were relatively democratic, the manner by which each congregation was virtually autonomous and elected and, quote, unelected its own preachers, elected its own selectmen, and they had the old deluder law, where 50 households or more, you had to have a public school system. So they were ahead of the curve from all other colonial regions as far as public education and literacy for children and adults. And they had price regulation over their somewhat capitalist economy. And just read that section, okay, and just see the examples by which New England was supposedly ahead of its time period, okay? And then, however, then follow that up with the one just before the Salem witch trials, and the section in which it shows them being very exclusive, very intolerant, very angst-filled, right? That's the classic revisionist interpretation of New England, that they were constantly paranoid of the devil. They were constantly paranoid of the sins of someone doing in the entire community. Remember, the idea of the covenant was the idea coming from the Hebrews of the Old Testament of the Bible, that if anyone in the community sinned against God, God was going to punish the whole community, not just that individual. So that got everyone involved in your business. The selectmen, for instance, would come and spy on people and try to make sure that they were living up to Judeo-Christian standards in their households during the year. And there was somewhat of a combination of church and state in that respect. So you definitely see that other side. I had a section on there on the Salem witch trials. Look into that, and just look into the atmosphere of anxiety and constantly looking over your shoulder and wondering what others are thinking about you, and what God is thinking about the community, and His judgment hanging over the community, etc., etc. Right? You definitely get that negative, angst-filled covenant image of the Puritans in that section, and that'll be on number 33 on the test. Okay, 34 again is a bit repetitive about the Dutch and their economic concerns tied to their toleration policy of religion, etc. 35, look at the Navigation Acts to see if they were stifling out of the textbook. All right. And that's going into about chapter 5. Which of the following is false regarding the sacred expedition? Were they always consistently universally praised as paternalistic purveyors of civilization? No, right? Remember, Marxist and conflict historians contend that they were ethnocentric institutions that were designed to kill Native American culture, right? So that to this day is very is very controversial about the missions. But remember, they came, 21 of them, to establish missions, pueblos, presidios, haciendas. They came to peacefully colonize Upper California. They were worried about the Russians and the English, as well as other concerns in trying to secure Spanish domination over the West Coast. And this was in the it began in 1769 and throughout the 1770s. And 37, I just said choose true, okay? The St. Lawrence and Ohio Valley, the Iroquois, they took advantage of the fur trade. They took over from their Huron enemies, and so that they could be the purveyors, the providers of the fur. And so that was an instance of agency of the Iroquois to control the fur trade. And they did that for a while. And there were other tribes that acted similarly, all right? So with 37, just in case I didn't go over that, that is true. 38, is St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest surviving Euro-American city? Yes. I thought I'd throw a couple factual ones in there. The Puritan notion of the covenant, is that tied to tolerance of individual lifestyles? Anything but, right? The idea of the covenant. And number 40, Tories in Parliament. I go ahead and tell you to choose false. We're going to jump right into that after this first test when we do the War for Independence. The Tories were actually the party that wanted to be tough on the Americans and believed that we needed to be put in our place regarding demands of our alleged rights under Mother England, under Great Britain as of 1707. All right, so if you have any other questions, please let me know. Otherwise, please, you have unlimited submissions until Sunday evening. Jump onto this, okay? And do your best, okay? And then I should be, I'm already feeling much better, so that we should be right back into having regular Zoom meetings beginning next week. All right, so thank you and good luck. Canvas message me should you have any questions. But again, watch these videos under modules, then go to quizzes. Then when you're in quiz on test number 1 in quizzes, go to questions and submit all of the questions by Sunday night. All right, good luck, you guys, okay? All right, bye-bye.